Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel, True North. It's been a couple weeks since our last episode. I didn't want to keep that much time between episodes, but life got in the way. Sometimes that happens, and things don't work out as we want them to. But having said that, let's get back into this next episode. This is Chapter 2, Testing the Eyewitness Evidence. Do the biographies of Jesus stand up to scrutiny? Lee Strobel, he was our court reporter, so he would go through and he would see a lot of court cases. He would investigate lots of court cases related to murders and different crimes and so forth. And he talks about when you witness or when you interview a witness or when you evaluate a witness's testimony, you have there's several different tests that you can go through to kind of see if they're actually being truthful or not. Lee Strobel goes a little bit through that. You can, like I said before, you can read the book if this interests you. It's so much more detailed. I'm just going to try to give you a quick overview and give you the main points here. But the first test number 1, is the intention test. This seeks to determine whether it was the state or implied intention of the writers to accurately preserve history. So in the case of the Gospels, I would say yes, and you can see that right when you take the Gospel of Luke. When you look at that, I'll just read it for you. This is a little tiny paragraph. This is Luke chapter 1, and he's stating his intention for writing the Gospel. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who, from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. So this is Luke writing to a guy named Theophilus, and he's telling him, hey, as I've gotten information from everybody else, and it seems clear and understandable to me, I would like to pass it on to you, and so that you know that the things that you've heard are true, and they actually did happen. So I think his intention for writing the Gospel is very clear. Another example would be John. John, in the book of John, near the end, he writes, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So he's stating clear as day why he's writing this. He's trying to persuade you, he's trying to show you that through all of his experiences, through all of what has happened to him and what he's seen, he believes that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and by believing in him, you will have eternal life. And that's, he was there, he was an eyewitness. So you have to take that for what it's worth. Is his intention clear in writing this? Yes, I think it is. Test number 2 is the ability test. It is important to remember that the Bible, in this case, the New Testament, was written in a different time, a different country, a different land, a different culture. So when you look at, if you're trying to see if it's truthful or if it's reasonable or if it actually did happen, if it's plausible that all this did happen, you have to also acknowledge that it was written in that you have to take these different things into consideration. It was not written in America in 2020. It wasn't written by an Anglo-American. It was written in the Middle East by Jewish people over 2,000 years ago. So you have to take that into consideration. So in line of that, you have to remember they didn't have computers back then. They didn't have paper as readily available as we do today. They had papyrus, they had animal hides, and those weren't they were a rarity then. And you didn't just go scribble notes all the time on any piece of papyrus or whatever. It was very valuable. You needed to know what you wanted to say, and you needed to say it correctly and properly. You couldn't don't have Microsoft Word where if you screw something up, you just hit backspace 20 times and then start over new. They didn't have that option, so they had to keep everything. They had to know what they were writing about, and they had to pick and discern what they wanted to write about. but lots of information was passed on by word of mouth. So oral tradition was very prevalent then. That was the big thing. So education, learning, worship, teaching in religious communities, that was all done by mouth or oral tradition. What's also important to note is the idea of memorization. Great emphasis was placed on that. You have in the Old Testament where, or at this time, it was common that rabbis would memorize the entire Old Testament. That was their wheelhouse. They were supposed to know what they were talking about if they're going to teach other people about what's going on, right? And if you don't always have a book in front of you or whatever, you don't have an iPad, you don't have a phone, you got to know this stuff. So they were able to memorize the Old Testament. So in light of that, what I'm trying to get at is if rabbis could memorize the entire Old Testament, why couldn't the disciples who witnessed all these things, or the people interviewing the disciples, is it implausible that they could remember all these happenings that occurred beforehand, and they could accurately bring them back so that they could be documented? I don't think so. The sayings of Jesus were probably 80 to 90% of what he said were in poetic form. That doesn't mean that they rhymed and everything, but all the sentence structure was similar, all the sentence length was similar in length, and there was lots of parallelism in the way that he presented his teachings, so it's easier to understand, or it's easier, for one, it's probably easier to understand, and for two, it's easier to memorize that. The idea of memorization also during this culture, during this time, was a little bit different. There was freedom in how much of the story was told. So you would have sometimes where maybe everything is told to you, or maybe sometimes you have where half of it's told to you, or 30% or 50% or 60% or whatever. But so you can change a little bit of the information that you give to somebody, but there's always, and you had freedom to tell the story in different ways. However, there were main points in the story that always had to be fixed, that always had to represent certain core teachings or happenings in that situation or of what you're talking about. So that could never be altered. That's how it was then. In the book that Lee Strobel writes here, The Case for Christ, he talks about a study in the Middle East where in oral tradition, 10 to 40% of the retelling of stories or sacred traditions could vary from one occasion to the next. And that is exactly, when you mesh it up with the Gospels, he writes, that's what you see in the variation in the stories of Matthew, Mark, Luke, for example, the Synoptic Gospels. They all tell essentially the same thing, or they still tell very similar things about Jesus and the happenings then, but they have different details in there. And that's what you see in this Middle Eastern study. You've probably heard it many times. Oral tradition is probably like a bunch of kindergartners playing telephone, right? Initially, this sounded pretty reasonable to me, and it kind of makes you a little bit suspicious on how accurate information can be passed down. But when you play telephone, you have a whole bunch of kids or individuals who can only pass one. So one person starts off saying something, right? My friend Joe Schmo is my best friend, and you have to tell that information on to another person, and they in turn tell that to another person, another person, another person. But you can't, having something already said to you or told to you, you can't go back and ask the person who told that to you again if you have the information correct. And they whisper it so everybody else doesn't hear it. So if you don't hear it right the first time, you're just supposed to, you kind of forced along to say something, right? And that's half the fun with telephone, is you take one sentence and you turn it around a little bit, and like I said, half the fun is finding out what statement comes out in the end compared to what the statement was initially. And that's not the case at all with oral tradition. Lee Strobel talks about if you were to compare that with telephone, that you would essentially have one person saying the facts, what happened, and then you would have every third person come out and say, hey, talk to the initial guy, do I have this right? Is this information correct? And allow, speaking out loud to the other person. And then he would also correct that information if he had it wrong, and then pass it on. So you'd have these checks and balances of maybe every third person saying, hey, do I have this still right? But also you would have the community, so the group of these people in the telephone ring saying, hey, that's not right. They could correct them as well if that wasn't correct, if that wasn't right. So it's not at all like the game of telephone. And I think that's necessary to know. And that makes things vastly different than what you normally hear of. The Gospels, oral tradition was nothing consistent or nothing reliable. That's not true. So test number 3, the character test. Was it in the character of the writers to be truthful? Was there any evidence of dishonesty or immorality that might taint the ability of their willingness to transmit the history accurately? I think you could say that the disciples and the followers of Jesus were very passionate about him, the true ones, and they did love him very much, and they respected him. So are they biased in that way of that they really, really like Jesus? Yes. However, if you really respect somebody, and if you really love them, and you really care about them, you will also be truthful to their, and given the fact that Jesus demanded morality and righteousness from his disciples, he didn't expect them to be perfect, but he demanded that they be moral, that they do things right and correctly, that they please and that they serve God. You could say that, even though they had a bias of love for Jesus, they would want to honor him. So they would be truthful in the way that they talked about him and the way that they presented their finding or their happenings that they had with him. So I do think that would pass the character test in that way. And you also see as well where 10 out of the 11 disciples, so you take away Judas, was the 12th, so you have 11 disciples, 10 out of 11 of them all died a horrible death as a martyr. The only one who didn't die was the Apostle John, who was exiled to the island of Patmos. So you have all these other 10 individuals who died for Jesus. They believed everything that they said, and they died for that. So I think that does pass the character test. And also, it's important to point out who would die willingly for a lie. You have today where people would say, yeah, okay, well, some people do die for a lie, okay, but they may not necessarily know that it's a lie. Or they don't, well, I will say it blatantly, they do not know that it's a lie. For example, people say, well, 9/11, you have the terrorists in the airplanes who died willingly because they believed in something. Yes, that's true. However, would they have gotten into that plane and did the same thing if they knew that it was a lie? Transpose that with the disciples, where they were with Jesus the entire time. They initially thought that he did die. He died. He was in the grave, and they thought he was never coming back. But yet he rose again from the dead, and they went out and they preached that. Who, in their right mind, would go out and preach that Jesus is alive, and he's the way, the truth, and the life, and he's ascended back into heaven? If you knew that was not the case, if you had stolen the body from the grave and buried it somewhere else, so that you could keep talking about this lie that you fabricated, who would do that? Who would willingly, like in Peter's case, be crucified upside down on a cross for a lie? That just doesn't happen. I don't see that happening.